Thanks so much. It's good to see so many people here. We're going to be talking today about visual support strategies in general and a bit of an overview to sort of serve as a foundation for the two upcoming sessions. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk first a little bit about just a general rationale for visual support strategies and why it is this is something that's useful for a variety of students that we might support. We're going to go over a variety of different kinds of visual support strategies and different ways that we might use them. We're also going to talk a little bit about what the research tells us. I know that not everyone is always very interested or excited about research, and we won't spend a lot of time talking about research, but I do want to make it clear what kind of research we have to support this work at this time, and also give you some ideas of where you could go to access some of that research if you're interested. And then we're going to spend the rest of this session really talking about different representations that we could use, different ways that we can set up visuals, and how to choose the best kind of visual support strategy, and particularly the kind of visual representation for a given individual. And then towards the end, I'm going to talk about some different materials and tools that I find useful when I'm putting visual supports together. So this will be the point where I help you spend your money, because I've done a really good job spending mine already. And I've got all kinds of ideas of where you can go to buy things that will help you in putting your things together. Okay, so to begin then, we're going to talk a bit about visual support strategies in general. And I suspect that those of you working in the field already have some sense and perhaps some experience regarding visual support strategies. These are, generally speaking, strategies that use a variety of concrete cues to help individuals of a variety of different kinds of needs understand information and express themselves more effectively. So often we're talking about individuals with autism or other kinds of developmental or intellectual disabilities or complex communication needs who might be having some difficulty with this. The kinds of visual supports that we'll be talking about can be represented in a variety of ways. So they might be represented using real objects. We might be using partial objects, and I'll be showing you some examples of this. We also might be using photographs or black line drawing symbols, and there are a variety of different brands of black line drawing symbols, so we'll look at a couple different sources for those. And then for individuals who may have some reading ability, we might also be using text. And so our visual supports could consist of one or more of all of those different items. And then finally, visual supports may be delivered via technology, so using tablet devices, which has become increasingly popular over the past several years. We're going to mostly be talking about non-technology-based kinds of supports, but certainly if anybody's interested in technology-related resources, I'd be happy to pull a few of those so that Tessa could post them or send them out to all of you. So before we actually start talking about providing visual supports and how we do that and what we should do, it's a good idea to sort of understand why it is that we might think about doing this sort of support, and particularly thinking about individuals with autism spectrum disorder. But certainly this information is relevant to those with other kinds of developmental or intellectual disabilities. These are often individuals who have strengths in concrete thinking, in rote memory, and in visual spatial skills. These are also individuals who often have difficulty processing information that they hear. And they tend to do better processing the things that they see and things that remain in time and space. Frankly, this is the case for many of us, and particularly as we get older, I think we often find that being able to look at things and see things helps us understand and remember information as our memory gets worse and worse as we get a bit older. When we look at these visual strategies, what we're really trying to do is take advantage of many of the visual spatial strengths that individuals with a variety of developmental disabilities or complex communication needs might have, with the idea that we're going to try to compensate for some of the language and memory challenges that these people might experience by instead providing them something that's visual and that remains in time and space so that they can look at it for as long as they need in order to understand the information and that they can come back to it as often as they need, if they need to sort of revisit the information or remember something. So if you think about communication, communication is really something that's quite complex, and there are a variety of skills that an individual needs to possess in order to be an effective communicator. First of all, the person needs to be able to sort of establish attention, to pay attention to another person that they're communicating with, but they also need to be able to sort of disengage their attention from one person and shift their attention to another individual or to another event happening in the environment. So there's this sort of rapidly changing stimuli that happens, and the need to be able to shift between all kinds of different things that are going on. People need to be able to attend to information, and particularly information that's being conveyed to them in a communicative sense. They need to store that information. At a later time, people typically need to retrieve information and then send or communicate information again. So communication is really a complex task that requires a number of skills. And when we think about communication that we might call through the air, sort of either auditory temporal in nature, so spoken language, or visual temporal in nature, so gestures or sign language, these are all ways of communicating where the stimuli is quite brief and it's transient. So if I'm speaking, as soon as the words are out of my mouth, they're gone. And it's impossible to be able to grab those words out of the air and listen to them again. Similarly, when I taught deaf students with developmental disabilities, although many of them were using American Sign Language, which is visual in nature, you use your eyes to access that information, the signs, just like speech, are brief in terms of their presentation. They're transient. So the signs are delivered, but then they disappear again. So it's very difficult for people who process information more slowly or need more time to recognize that information is being sent their way. They often have difficulty with this kind of rapid stimuli that's coming at them. And so if we can provide stimuli information that's visual in nature, but also spatial, in that it stays in time and space, it's static, it's non-transient, it doesn't disappear, it stays there, allowing the person to revisit that, to look at it for as long as they need. We find that this kind of stimuli can often help with many of the communication challenges that these individuals experience when the information is more transient in nature. So based on that understanding, for decades now, people have been looking at different ways to use visual support strategies to help individuals across the lifespan, so from young children, but all the way through adults, of varying degrees of ability and varying degrees of need. And even more recently, people have also looked at research related to visual support strategies in the field of geriatrics and helping people with dementia and Alzheimer's, for example. And across all of those individuals and across the lifespan, people have been looking at using visual support strategies to achieve a variety of outcomes or to support people in a variety of different ways. One of those ways is to increase independent functioning so that people can function as independently as possible without the need of someone else being nearby to prompt them. To make life more predictable so that individuals know what's going to happen in their day, what's going to happen across the week, across the month, and so on. The individuals that we often support are people who have difficulty with predictability and might often engage in problem behavior because their life isn't very predictable. So we might use visual support strategies as a way to make their world a bit more predictable and sort of as a byproduct of that, reduce some of the problem behavior. We can also use visual support strategies to teach a variety of specific skills and behaviors, everything from daily living skills all the way through to vocational skills and kind of everything in between. We can teach rules and social expectations. So particularly when we're thinking about, trying to teach children how to understand their social environment, understand behavioral expectations, to teach adults what the social expectations are in a vocational setting. All of those kinds of things we can use visual support strategies for. We can use visual support strategies to support and enhance communication and conversation. And then finally, we can use visual support strategies to help individuals access academic instruction. So when we're talking about having children in inclusive learning settings, oftentimes we need to make the content of that instruction, whether it's teacher-delivered instruction or activities that students are doing, we need to make that more accessible for them. And visual support strategies are a way for us to achieve that. So we're going to be talking over this session and the following 2 sessions about a number of these outcomes and different ways that we can use visual support strategies to achieve this. In terms of the research, I mentioned that we do have decades of research at this point, and more recently there have been some research consortiums, some large groups of researchers that have been going through these decades of research, pulling all of the evidence and really evaluating the evidence that we have to date on visual support strategies. One group is the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorder. And they've looked at all of the research related to visual supports for individuals with autism. Not to say that many of the things that they've looked at don't relate to children with other developmental disabilities, because they do, but this group is specifically interested in autism. In terms of the research, what they found is that we have evidence for individuals aged 3 to 22 that says visual support strategies are evidence-based, they're effective to address a variety of skills. So as you see on your screen, I have a whole list of skills that have been addressed with visual support strategies where we have sufficient evidence to say it's an evidence-based practice. So social communication, behavior skills, all the way up to adaptive skills or daily living skills, academic skills, play skills, and so on. If you're interested in looking at the report from the National Professional Development Center, you can certainly Google them, and I'll make a point of giving Tessa the link for the NPDC. This group has also created a number of learning modules that are free that you can access online that address a number of evidence-based practices, visual support strategies being one, but they have a whole host of other strategies that have also been deemed evidence-based. So if you're interested in accessing some of those resources, I'll make sure that you get access to the links for those. So moving on from the research, and let's start to get into some of the nitty-gritty about visual supports. It's really important to understand that there's no one correct way to visually represent information, that it really is going to be necessary for us to match what the visual is like to the individual's strengths and needs. So all visuals are not created equally in the eyes of all people. Commonly, we're going to use things like objects or photographs or some sort of black line drawing graphic symbol, or if we've got a reader that we're working with, somebody who has the ability to read, we might be using text as well. So that's commonly the general categories of visual representations that we might use. And it's really important to carefully select representations that are a good fit for given individuals. Before we get to talking about how we choose representations for individuals, let me just talk a little bit about the specific kinds of representations so that you all have a sense of what it is I'm talking about. So when I talk about object cues, you might also hear people refer to these as tangible symbols or tactile symbols. And these are all 3-dimensional type symbols that individuals can pick up and feel. They've got much more tactile information, and that's often how people gain information from these symbols as opposed to looking at them. Often we will use these kinds of symbols for individuals who are blind or deafblind, but they're certainly useful as well for individuals who have sight but might have very significant intellectual disabilities that sort of preclude them from understanding and interpreting 2-dimensional representations. So I've worked with several individuals, both children and young adults, who have quite significant and profound intellectual impairments, and they really don't understand photographs or graphic symbols, but the 3-dimensional representation is much more concrete and realistic from their perspective, and they're much more readily able to understand that information when it's presented that way. These are just some other examples of object cues or tangible symbols, just that you can kind of get a sense of the things that people might use for representations. If you look at the top left panel, you'll see things like a comb, which would represent brushing your hair. There's a tube of toothpaste. There's a spoon to represent eating. There's a DVD to represent either watching movies, or if it's a CD, it could represent music. In the lower panel on the left, there's a sock that has to do with putting clothes away. There's a dried plant that represents watering plants. And then sometimes we need to get creative. You see in the top right corner, there's an image and it's labeled swing. And it's actually two small pieces of chain with a little piece of rubber attached to both ends to make a miniature swing, essentially. The dismissal symbol, although it's a little bit hard to see in the image, is the buckle from a backpack. And it would represent dismissal time because that's when students put on their backpacks. So often when we're thinking about object cues, it's really important to sort of consider the learner's experience in the environment and what the most appropriate three-dimensional representation might be. So for example, sometimes I'll go into school settings and I'll see a child who has a variety of object cues set out, and one of them will be for toilet. And for toilet, they have a small miniature dollhouse type toilet. And oftentimes people will report to me when I'm doing a school visit that the student doesn't seem to be understanding what that means. And I'll ask people at the school to sort of consider the child's experience of sitting on the toilet and how the experience of sitting on the toilet is either the same or different than the experience of holding that small miniature toilet. And people start to realize that those are actually quite different. And when we're talking about learners who might not have really clear concepts of all of these different things in their environment yet, we might need to be much more concrete and really think about, well, what is the child's actual experience? And so then if you think a student is sitting on the toilet, well, what's nearby? The toilet paper roll. So maybe a toilet paper roll might be a more appropriate cue to represent going to the toilet. Same thing for taking a ride in a car. Sometimes people will use miniature cars to try and represent going for a car ride. But again, that often doesn't really reflect a student's experience of sitting in a car. So my recommendation is often to go get a piece of seat belt. So you've got the seat belt clasp and a little bit of belt on either side, and that much more accurately reflects something that the student comes into contact with when they're sitting in the car going for a ride. So it's really important to think about those kinds of things. And as a clinician, I've found that the best sources and resources around object cue creation comes from the field of visual impairments and or deafblindness. Particularly in the field of deafblindness, they use object cues quite a lot. And those folks are really quite skilled in coming up with different kinds of object cues to represent activities and places and people. So when I'm sort of stuck for ideas, I will often go to, say, the Perkins School for the Blind website, or the Texas School for the Deaf and Blind also has some information. So there are a variety of places where people who work in the field of deafblindness can really support us in identifying object cues that'll be useful for our learners, including those learners who are sighted but have some pretty significant impairments. So those are object cues. We might also use photographs. And so this is pretty straightforward. It doesn't require a lot of explanation, but simply photographs of items, places, activities, people, and so on. What we want to make sure we're doing with photographs, though, is ensuring that the photograph is clear, and also making sure that there isn't a whole bunch of irrelevant information in the background. So you see the two pictures that are on your screen. The items, the cooked chicken and the marble run, pop out really clearly from a plain white background. There isn't any distracting information in the background. There aren't a bunch of other toys. There isn't other food. It's just the chicken, just the marble run. And so when you're thinking about photographs, that's something that you would be looking for as well. I'll talk about some sources where you can purchase some pre-designed photographs that are of really high quality. Certainly you can make your own as well. You can use a digital camera, but you have to, again, be careful to make sure that you're setting things up so that there's a nice contrasting background behind the item that you're trying to highlight. Otherwise, our learners aren't going to be very sure what it is that they should be paying attention to. In terms of graphic symbols, so these are black and white line drawing computer generated type icons. They've also been used for decades. They can be used to represent a variety of things, including items and activities and so on. And there are many brands of black line drawing symbols. I suspect that many of you are already familiar with picture communication symbols, which is the one on the left. You see the laundry room. That comes from the Boardmaker software. The one in the middle, Symbol Sticks, is another brand of black and white line drawing. And in fact, it looks quite similar to the picture communication symbols. They're sufficiently distinguished so that they're their own brand and they're not infringing upon the picture communication symbols rights. But I have found that learners who are familiar with picture communication symbols can make a nice transition to Symbol Sticks. They don't seem to have any real difficulty. Symbol Sticks is available through an online subscription, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit as well, and where you can subscribe to get those. But I will often use sort of picture communication symbols and Symbol Sticks combined, because the Symbol Sticks library tends to be a bit larger than the Boardmaker library of picture communication symbols, but I prefer the authoring capabilities that I have with Boardmaker. So I tend to sort of mix the two together. The third symbol that you see on the right is a widget symbol. This is another brand of symbols. These are used more often in the UK, although they also sometimes appear on some different augmentative and alternative communication devices. These are only 3 of the many brands of black line drawing symbols. So what's important to recognize is that each of these represent a different brand, and there are many other brands, but these are all symbols. The other distinction that I want to spend some time making is that these symbols, regardless of which brand they are, none of them are PECs. So that's often a surprise to some people because people have been calling these symbols PECs for a while, but there's an important distinction between the two. So the symbols themselves, the graphic symbols that I talked about a moment ago, picture communication symbols from Boardmaker, Symbol Sticks, the widget symbols, and other symbol brands, they're all different brands of graphic symbols or different brands of black line drawing symbols. Call them sort of what you will, but they're symbols. PECs is something entirely different and has nothing to do with the symbol itself. PECs stands for the Picture Exchange Communication System, and it's a manualized intervention program that's specifically designed to teach communication-related behaviors. And it was designed out of some challenges that folks were seeing, particularly with individuals with autism, in relation to initiating exchanges with other people, getting the attention of another person before, say, pointing to a symbol. And so the PECS protocol teaches individuals to take a symbol or a group of symbols sequenced in a sentence and give that symbol or symbols to a communication partner as a communication behavior. So I really want to make clear the distinction that the symbols themselves are not called PECs. If you're saying PECs as a term, you should be using that term to refer to the picture exchange communication system. It just makes everything clear for everybody so that we all know what we're talking about. So before we go on, I'm going to get you guys to use your raise hand feature, and we're going to do a little activity. I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures of people doing things or pictures of symbols or symbols being used in different ways. And what I'd like you to do is raise your hand if you think that, yes, it is an example of PECs, and leave your hand down if you think that, no, it is not an example of PECs. And as we go through each picture, I'll kind of describe a little bit because they're pictures rather than videos. So just to make sure that you understand what you're looking at, and then you can go ahead and raise for yes or leave your hands down for no. So here's a picture of a sentence strip. It has 2 symbols on it. It says, I want, and I think it has cup in the next picture, and you see there's an adult holding it, and a child is pointing to the symbols that he's just handed over to the adult. So is this PECs? Raise your hand if it's yes. I'll give you another 5 seconds to think and respond. Great. I see lots of yeses. So this is indeed an example of PECS, the picture exchange communication system. The child has given that sentence strip to an adult as a way of communicating. So you can lower your hands and I'll show you another example. So here's a calendar and the calendar has some symbols on it. Is this PECS? Okay, I'll give you 5 more seconds for anyone who wants to raise their hand, or those of you who don't want to raise your hand, 5 more seconds to make a decision. Okay, good. So this is not an example of PECS. This would be no. This is a weekly calendar and it has some symbols on it, but it doesn't involve any exchanging. It's simply a visual support. So when we talk about visual schedules next week, we'll come back and look at some examples like this of calendars. So this is just simply symbols velcroed on a calendar. So that doesn't equal PECS. PECS is when we exchange to communicate a message to someone else, not symbols on a calendar. Okay, here's another one coming up. So here's a key ring. It's got a bunch of symbols on it. So these are just some symbols from the Boardmaker program that are out for display. Is this an example of PECS? Okay, 5 more seconds. Okay, so this one as well is not an example of PECS because there's no evidence of any exchanging happening. These are symbols, and we might use these symbols in PECS, but themselves, the symbols, they're not PECS. We would call these picture communication symbols. That's the brand. So if you want to call them by the brand name, you could call them picture communication symbols. And the abbreviation for that, and here's where some of the confusion comes, picture communication symbols, PCS. And PECS is just one additional letter. That's where part of the confusion sometimes comes, I think. So these are just symbols. You can call them symbols. You could call them graphic symbols. You could call them images. You could call them icons, but they're not PECS. Here's another example. So here we have a woman holding a toy. There's a child who has a picture that represents that toy, and the man behind the child is helping the child learn to give the picture to the woman. Is this an example of PECS? I'll give you 5 more seconds. Great, lots of raised hands. This is an example of PECS. So this is an example of what it looks like when we're first teaching an individual to use that specific protocol to communicate, where an individual seated behind the child provides some physical prompts to teach the child how to make that exchange. All right, ready for another one? Here we go. Is this an example of PECS? This you see looks like a 5-point scale with some feelings on it, where a child would place how they feel on any given letter or level of the scale. Is this an example of PECS? Okay, 5 more seconds to respond. Okay, good. So this is also not an example of PECS. This is a visual support. It's a visual support that's often used to help teach some self-regulation skills to individuals so that they can identify how they're feeling and perhaps how they should behave based on how they're feeling. If they're getting upset, perhaps they should go ask for help, for example. But this is not an example of PECS. This is just an example of using symbols as a visual support strategy. All right, here's another example. Here we see a tray with some items on it that a child can choose from, and a communication book where the child is lifting a symbol off to hand to the adult. Is this an example of PECS? I'll give you 5 more seconds. Fantastic. So yes, this is an example of PECS. This is an example where a child is handing over a picture for a toy, and the adult is going to wait for him to choose the toy. And she's going to be looking to make sure that the toy he chooses matches the picture as a way of assessing his understanding of the different pictures. Okay, but this is an example of PECS. Good job. Here's another one. So we've got a child. She's got some symbols on a red strip here that she's about to hand to an adult. Is this an example of PECS? Five more seconds. All right, perfect. So this is an example of PECS. This is an example of a child who has sequenced some symbols onto a sentence strip to create a sentence, handing the sentence over to an adult to then communicate that information. So this is an example of PECS. Here, you can put your hands back down. Here is an example with a symbol. Is this symbol PECS? I'll give you 5 seconds to respond or make a choice. All right, good job. So this is a symbol. It's a picture communication symbol, but it is not PECS. It would only be PECS if you saw that symbol being exchanged or given to another person. So the symbol in and of itself, not PECS. Good work. Okay, you guys can put your hands down. And I've got a couple more. How about this one? So we've got a kid. He's got a book. He's putting a sentence together that says, "I see dog." And you can't see it in the image, but he's preparing the symbol strip to give to an adult to tell what he sees in the book. Is this an example of PECS? All right, 5 more seconds to respond. Great. So yes, this is an example of PECS. You've got a child who's putting a sentence strip together and is going to communicate that. Something about PECS that sometimes people don't realize is that PECS is not just for making requests. Teaching requests is the first thing that we teach in PECS, but then we go on to commenting. So being able to say things like, "I see," "I hear," "I taste," and so on and so forth. And that's what this student is doing here, and is preparing a sentence strip to give to another person to convey some information. So this is an example of PECS. All right, your hands are all down. I've got 2 more. So here's this one, a bunch of symbols on a grid. Is this an example of PECS? Is there an exchange happening? All right, good job, you guys. This is not an example of PECS. This is an example of symbols, of picture communication symbols, but not PECS. The symbols themselves are not PECS. Last one, so hands down, and here we go. In this case, we have a child exchanging a photograph of an apple to get an apple. Is this an example of PECS? Give you a few more seconds to respond. And yes, indeed. Good job, you guys. This is an example of PECS. PECS can be done with photographs. It can be done with black and white line drawings. It can be done with object cues. So the type of representation doesn't matter. PECS is all about the exchange. So just the key thing to remember, we're not going to be talking about PECS. That's a whole different workshop. We're going to be talking about using those symbols that are different brand names of symbols. We're going to just talk about symbols generically, using symbols to refer to all kinds of things. So we can use symbols to refer to people and places and things and activities. But when we talk about those individual symbols, when we talk about using those symbols in a schedule, for example, or on a communication board where people are pointing. Those kinds of things are not PECs, okay? If you're really interested in PECs and learning more about PECs, you can always Google PECs and get Pyramid Educational Consultants. And I know that in the States, you guys are a bit luckier than we are perhaps in Canada. We don't get access to PECs training quite as often as you folks do. There are usually more training opportunities in the States from Pyramid Educational Consultants. So if you're looking for PECs training, that would be where to go. We're going to spend our time talking about using symbols in all kinds of other ways, okay? So thank you for participating. Helps make the online thing seem a little bit more like there are actual people out there. So thank you for participating. All right, so let's just kind of sum up a little bit, and then I'll take a few questions before we move on. When we're thinking about symbols, and we've now talked about objects, we've talked about photographs, we've talked about graphic symbols, we've talked about text. It's really important that before we go ahead and make a whole bunch of visual supports, that we first determine what kind of support is most appropriate, what kind of symbol is most appropriate for a given person. What symbol is it that the person recognizes the best? And so we're going to need to look at and perhaps assess to answer this question. Are we going to use objects for a given learner? Are we going to use photographs? If we use photographs, should they be color or black and white? Are we going to use graphic symbols of some sort? Most often from the Boardmaker program, that's kind of the software that most people are using. If we are using graphic symbols, are we going to use color symbols, or are they going to be black and white? And then finally, does the person read? And if so, why not use text? And really, if the person reads well enough to mostly use text, it also saves a bit of time in terms of making up a bunch of materials. So we're going to want to figure out what kind, or sometimes what kinds, because sometimes people will use multiple types of symbols. We want to figure out what's going to meet a given person's needs the very best. And we'll also want to be thinking about how quickly a person learns to recognize symbols, because sometimes we'll be in a situation where we've got a new learner, or we might have a learner who's quite significantly impacted, and it may be unclear what they understand right now, or they might understand a little bit, but not a lot. We also want to think about, well, how quickly do they learn to recognize new symbols? If I've got a learner who learns to recognize graphic symbols pretty quickly, then I won't be too concerned if they only know 3 or 5 symbols right now, because I know that with a bit of exposure, they're going to learn quite quickly. Similarly, though, I've worked with other students where they have a hard time understanding objects. I'm certainly not going to be providing them with photographs or graphic symbols because they're having a hard time with 3-dimensional objects, and perhaps they even learn quite slowly. So I need to take that into consideration when I'm making some decisions. So before we get into how we assess that and how we make some good decisions about our representations, do we have any questions that have come up that you'd like me to answer right now before we move ahead? And I'll wait for Tessa to shoot any questions my way. If there are any, I don't see any questions. So going once, going twice, it's your last opportunity for now. All right, so on we go. So if we're going to start putting together visual support strategies, like I say, it's really important that we understand the type of symbol that's going to be most easily understood by any given person that we're working with. So we'll often start with a symbol assessment, right? You don't want to spend a whole bunch of time developing visual supports, laminating things, cutting things out, putting Velcro all over everything, just to learn that the kind of symbol you selected is the wrong kind of symbol for that person. So you want to figure this out ahead of time. And you're going to try and figure out sort of what is it that the person understands right now. It's kind of within their current capability. And it's a way of representing information that's not too hard, not too easy, and kind of just right. Often our students aren't going to recognize all of the possible symbols we could present, but we get a sense of they mostly understand a specific kind of symbol, and then that's what we want to move forward with. Some individuals, like I said, might use more than one type of symbol to represent information. So for example, for really familiar things that happen in their life quite regularly, they might use graphic symbols for that, a sort of higher order symbol. But for community places that are perhaps less familiar, they use photographs because those photographs are perhaps a bit more concrete for them, okay? So again, it's going to be very individualized as to what is appropriate for any given person, okay? So we need to do a symbol assessment often, and there are different ways that we could do this depending on our learner and our learner's abilities and the information that other people might be able to provide us. So there are kind of a few main ways that I might do a symbol assessment. I might begin by just interviewing. So I might ask the parent, the caregiver, or the teacher, the classroom aide, whoever it is that's working with that person and knows that person well, some questions about how that person understands some common symbols. And so I'll ask about things like logos, right? Is this a kid who understands logos? You know, is this a kid who perhaps, you know, when you're driving by McDonald's, they have a bit of a tantrum because they see the golden arches in the distance and they want to stop there, and you've started to turn in a different direction and they're upset by that. Although it's not delightful that they're having a tantrum in the car while you're driving, it does give me some information about how they understand symbols and logos. I've had students before who might find symbols or logos in newspapers or other print media, and they bring those logos to their parent, and it makes it pretty clear that they understand some of these basic logos that are familiar to them. I might ask about whether or not students are able to recognize pictures in books. So if you said, you know, where's the dog? Can the child point to the dog? I'd ask questions about whether or not the learner enjoys looking at books, if the learner reads, because sometimes our learners do read, and if they can read, we might as well capitalize on that. I'll also ask some questions about what the person's used in the past successfully. I'll also ask if there's anything that hasn't worked in the past because I don't want to repeat past mistakes. So I might interview. That usually gives me a little bit of information, but often not enough that I would want to make actual decisions on. It'll sort of give me some guidance as to where I want to go next in my assessment. I might do some observations, so I might observe the person with books and with print and kind of note how they react to different things. But most often, given the population that I work with, and I work primarily with kids with autism, both hearing kids and deaf kids, or kids with other developmental disabilities or complex needs, I'm most often doing a direct assessment because interview and observation doesn't quite give me enough information. In some cases, I might have a hunch about what's going to work well based on some of the interview and observation information, and I might make a small set of symbols that I'll use for a couple of activities and see how it goes. But most often what I will do is a formal symbol assessment. So I'm going to talk you through the process of how to prepare for that. So when you're preparing for a symbol assessment, the first thing that you want to do is collect about 10 to 15 things, items, that the person is familiar with. So these are going to be objects that they encounter in their day-to-day lives. And then for each of those 10 to 15 items, you're going to collect or create, as the case may be, an identical set of objects. So if one of your objects is a comb for brushing hair, you're going to have 2 combs that look exactly the same. Then you'll also have a non-identical set of objects. So a second comb that's a different color, a different size perhaps. You'll have color photographs of each object, black and white photos of each object, color graphic symbols for each object, a black and white graphic symbol for each object, and then finally printed word cards. If you want an in-depth look at symbol assessment, Buchelman and Brenda 2013 is the most recent AAC textbook that they've put out, and they have a section on symbol assessment. So if you're interested in that, that's where you would go. And if you'd like the full citation, I'm happy to provide that to Tessa so that she can send that out to you as well. So here are some examples. This is my symbol assessment kit. I've got sort of a kit with some common items that often are familiar to most people that I do a symbol assessment for. And I'll talk you through some of the things that are on here. So I've got a toy hamburger up here to represent a hamburger. I've got a real bowl, a container of bubbles, a toy orange, a balloon, a toy banana. This here in the bottom left-hand corner, that's an actual real chip. It's a chip that I painted in a resin type stuff that hardens the chip. And so that chip I still own, and it's about 25 years old now, but it looks like the real chip that a kid actually eats. And so I've got one for my symbol assessment kit. I've got a pair of scissors, and I've got a washcloth. So these are some things that individuals might come across frequently in their day-to-day lives that we could use for a symbol assessment. And when we're looking for identical items, I would just then make sure that I have 2 of everything that you see in this picture, okay? So those are the identical objects, right? There they are, identical. You could also then look at non-identical objects. I don't have a picture of non-identical objects, but you would, for example, want a different shape and size bubble container, a different color and shape of balloon, a different kind of chip, those sorts of things. So the same item, but in a slightly different presentation. And then for each of those things, you want to have really good color photographs with a nice contrasting background so that the item pops off the page. No text in this case, because we want to just assess the person's ability to understand the photograph itself. So we want to only have one stimulus on the card. So those are our color photographs. You can also have black and white photographs. So for some individuals, they might have unique visual needs. Black and white might be better than color, and so you might also have black and white photos. Here's an example of color graphic symbols. These are all picture communication symbols, or PCS, from Boardmaker. And you can see that they, again, represent all of those items, and there's no text on any of the cards, so that, again, we're just zeroing in on the graphic image itself. So there's only one stimulus being presented at a time. Here's an example of those same picture communication symbols, but in black and white format. Again, some kids do better with black and white than color. I worked with a young boy with autism once, and he came into kindergarten not really understanding 2-dimensional representations well at all. He mostly understood 3-dimensional objects, real-sized objects. But when we were assessing his ability to understand graphic symbols, on the few occasions where he was able to match a 3-dimensional object to a graphic symbol, he did so most accurately when those graphic symbols were black and white, not color. And for him, it seemed almost as if the color provided him with too much information, and he kind of got lost in the color and wasn't really paying attention to the meaning of the representation. And so for him, he actually started with object cues and then moved his way to black and white graphic symbols, and we skipped over color altogether, right? So sometimes you think, oh, color will make it easier to understand. And in many cases, that's true, but not always. So you want to check black and white graphic symbols. And then finally, if it makes sense to do so, right? If the child's been exposed to text, if there's a chance that the child might have some reading skills, then you can also assess printed word cards. So you would make a set of printed word cards as well. So those are all your materials for your symbol assessment. And then once you've got your materials together, there are some different ways that you might go about assessing. The first way that you might assess is through a receptive language format. For this to work, the learner has to be able to follow verbal instructions, whether it's give me or point to or look at, that kind of thing. So we'll talk more about that in a second. The other format is a yes-no format, and this requires that your student can give a clear yes-no response, whatever that yes-no response may be, but they have a clear, predictable yes-no response. The final format is a visual matching format. And in my clinical work with the population I serve, this is the format that I use most often, because most of the individuals I support are unable to follow the verbal instructions reliably and may not necessarily have a clear yes-no response. The visual matching format just requires the ability to match. Often I'm working with kids with autism, and this is an area of particular strength. So I'm taking their ability to match and using that within the context of assessment. And it tends to often work better for those individuals. And if need be, I can also use a few items to teach the matching task. And then once they understand what I want, then I can use the rest of the items for testing. So let me show you a little bit in more detail what each of these formats would look like and how you would gather that information. In a receptive language format, you would put 2 or more items, be they objects or photographs or graphic symbols or text, and you'd put them in front of the individual, and then you'd ask them to either give you the whatever item or point to the item or to look at the item. So this is good for individuals who might have complex motor needs and may not be able to physically point to or pick up the item if they can even look at the item. So for some individuals, you might be holding the items out and up so that they can just look forward, left and right. So you need to think about how you set that up for a given person. But the essence of this format is you ask the person to indicate a particular symbol. So if you say touch the ball or look at the ball or point to the ball, that they direct their attention to the ball, okay, to demonstrate that they know the difference between those two symbols. When you're doing this kind of an assessment, what you're going to want to make sure that you do is that you test all of the stimuli against one another. And I've got sort of part of a data sheet up here to give you an idea of what that looks like. But on this data sheet, there are a number of symbols that are being targeted for assessment: ball, fork, toothbrush, doll, shoe, lock, bubbles. And then you see that there's a column for stimuli presented, and in this case, ball and fork. And then sometimes you want to make sure that the ball is on the child's left and fork is on the child's right. And then you also want to switch so that you account for any potential side bias where a child always chooses what's on the left or always chooses what's on the right. And then you would simply, as you present different stimuli, you could tally. If they got it correct, you could put a check mark or an X, and just essentially keep count of which items they were able to identify correctly as you go through your list. And you can see you need to do multiple presentations, and you need to make sure that everything is kind of matched with everything else, so that ball is compared to fork, ball is compared to toothbrush, ball is compared to doll, ball is compared to shoe, and so on and so forth. So we make sure that we get a really good sense overall of what a person is able to identify and discriminate between, okay? So that gives you a little bit of an idea of how that works. In the yes-no format, you're only going to present one thing at a time, because you're going to ask the student, is this whatever? You're going to have your questions kind of in random order. This is also really good for people who have limited motor abilities, so they may not be able to point to or even reliably direct their head to a given item left or right, for example. But if they have a clear yes-no response, you can then hold up or show them an item and say, for example, is this a fork, while you're showing them the ball, and hopefully they say no, okay? And then again, you want to have a way that you're taking data. This is one way that you could do it, where you just list all of the stimuli that are presented, and it's either correct or incorrect. You gather the information from the assessment that way. And then finally, there's this visual matching format. And like I said, this is the one that I use most often, pretty much always. I can't even think of a time when I've used any of the other formats with any of my clients. In this case, you're going to have 2 stimuli on the table, so 2 photographs or 2 graphic symbols or 2 whatever, and you give an object to the person and you ask the person to match, okay? Now, at first, you're going to have them matching object to object, then object to non-identical object, object to photo, object to symbol, all the way through. And essentially what you're looking for, regardless of the type of assessment you're doing, you're trying to see sort of how complex a representation the person is able to understand. And so you'll assess up until the point that the student is no longer able to give accurate responses most of the time. And that kind of will give you a sense that you sort of maxed out their ability in terms of understanding, okay? When you're taking data for a visual matching format, it could be something like this. Again, it's the same kind of data form that we saw with the receptive language format, where you present a couple stimuli and then you would just put a check mark. If you gave them the ball, for example, and they needed to match the ball to ball and they got it right, then you would make a mark a check mark next to ball to indicate that they got that correct. And then you would gather your data that way. So that at the end of the day, you've got a sense of how many items the person is able to accurately match versus not match at all, okay? So like I said, you're going to go through all of the different items and assess the person's ability to understand identical objects, then non-identical objects, then photographs, and perhaps color followed by black and white, then graphic symbols, color, then black and white, and then if it makes sense, assess text as well. It's also a really good idea to repeat this assessment at least over a few days, and certainly in different contexts. So the first assessment should happen in a fairly calm, quiet context, but you also want to make sure that you're assessing in environments that are a bit more naturalistic, the busy classroom, the noisy mall, places where the person engages on a regular basis, because they need to be able to use those symbols in those busy, noisy environments. So sometimes you'll see an individual can identify and correctly match objects to picture communication symbols in a calm environment, but as soon as they're in a busy, noisy environment, they can no longer do that. They can only use photographs. They can match photographs to objects. And then that tells you you're probably going to need to simplify a little bit, use photographs instead, and probably work your way towards graphic symbols over time. Right? So the whole point of this, we want to provide visual support so that the person understands now. We don't want them to have to spend a year learning how to understand the visual supports. So a symbol assessment helps us identify what the person understands now so that we can make visual supports that are most likely to actually help them today and not a year from now, okay? Certainly when you do a symbol assessment, chances are that students are not going to reach 100% accuracy, and that's okay. You're looking for about 75 to 80% accuracy, where most of the time, with most things, they're able to identify the symbols that you're presenting, whether they be photographs or picture communication symbols or whatnot. And you can teach the rest. But you're kind of looking for what do they understand most of the time, and that's what you'll select, okay? A few questions that sometimes arise from symbol assessments. What do you do if the student doesn't demonstrate the ability to identify any kind of symbol? Like you can't seem to get a correct response out of the student at all. There are a few things that you might want to check. And the first thing you want to check is to make sure that the student understands the assessment task. So sometimes it's an issue that the student doesn't understand what it is they're supposed to do. So split up the items in your assessment kit, right? Maybe keep 2 or 3 or 4 items for teaching. And then once the student has learned what it is they're supposed to do, then use the rest of the items for your actual assessment, right? Because it's kind of unfair for us to make some determination about what students do and do not understand as far as representations go if they haven't actually understood what it is we want them to do. And lots of times our students aren't very clear on what it is we want them to do. So sometimes we have to do some teaching first. Sometimes the issue might be related to motivation. Assessment isn't usually a really exciting, fun kind of activity. It's not surprising that students aren't always motivated and excited to engage in these kinds of activities. And if they're not sufficiently motivated, we're not going to get much information about what they understand. So what we might want to do then is increase reinforcement, reward them whenever they correctly identify symbols. And that could be by allowing them to play with a toy as a break activity in between trials. It could be that you deliver tickles and praise and high fives or treats or whatever it is that the person is reinforced by. We want to let them know when they're doing something correctly. And then if they're sufficiently motivated, they start engaging in the task and they start giving correct answers. Okay, so sometimes motivation might be an issue. The other thing then to ask yourself, if you've kind of taken care of the assessment understanding issue, you've taught the task, now they know what they're supposed to do. You've addressed the motivation aspect and they are sufficiently motivated, but it just seems really clear or it's even just highly unlikely based on your experience that the student does not understand any form of symbols. You can't reliably get them to match identical object to identical object. Then you're going to start with three-dimensional object cues. Those are the most transparent form of symbol. You're going to have to teach those over time through exposure and experience, right? So certainly if a student doesn't demonstrate an ability to understand any kind of symbol, you want to start with the easiest. Certainly object cues can be cumbersome. When we talk about visual schedules next week, we'll talk a little bit about some things that you can do to try and mitigate the degree of cumbersomeness of object cues. But certainly they're not something that people like to use for the long term if they don't have to. They take up a lot of space. They're kind of not very portable. If you're working with a student, though, for example, who might be deaf-blind, they might be requiring object cues or perhaps, tangible symbols later on that are not full three-dimensional whole objects, but you're probably going to need to continue with something that's object cue in nature. So again, the needs of your students dictate the decisions that you make about symbols. We should be choosing symbols that are appropriate for our students. So then we should think about kind of the future. So symbol assessment tells us what the student is most likely to understand right now. And at the same time, we sort of want to think about where might we be able to take the student in the future, because there are more refined kinds of symbols or more refined kinds of representations that people could use over time as they grow and develop. So when you're doing your symbol assessment, you kind of want to be watching for what might be the next level of symbol that the person might use. So a person who's using objects today, it might make sense for them to use photographs next. So our next goal will be to teach them to understand photographs. You might have a student who's using photographs right now, but you want to work towards transitioning to graphic symbols, because when you're using graphic symbols, those can also be used in an academic context more easily to adapt curriculum. So we'd kind of like the student to understand graphic symbols, because that then helps him access other learning opportunities. Some individuals might be using graphic symbols today, but probably they'll be able to learn to read and write, and they'll use text in the future. So you're always kind of thinking about what are we using today, and then where might we be going, right? And it's not always linear like this. So it's not always first objects, then photos, then graphic symbols, then text. Like I said, I had a student, a deaf student with autism, who started with objects and then moved straight to black and white graphic symbols, because that's what made the most sense for him. That's what he understood the best, okay? So it's really important that you individualize this. When you finally get to preparing your visual supports, the other thing that you can do is take your current symbol, for example, objects, and you can pair that with what you anticipate will be the next symbol. So you see in this picture on your slide, there are objects. There's a cassette tape, clearly from the old days, representing music with a picture symbol for tape. And there's a little, a few keyboard keys that represents playing the piano, music class, a little tiny miniature book, and the symbol for book, and then a piece of cloth that is likely the same cloth as for the swim bag that the swim clothes are in, and then swimming. And so they've paired all of those objects with picture communication symbols, and the idea being that over time, the person will learn to make those associations, and then you can start to fade away the object cues. Next week, when we talk about visual schedules, I'll give you an example of a student who began with an object cue schedule and then transitioned to a picture communication symbol schedule. And I'll talk to you about how we knew that it was time to make that transition and how we supported him in making that transition. So that's coming next week. Some other things that you should also be thinking about when you're trying to determine the most appropriate kind of representation for someone is their visual acuity. Visual acuity will dictate the size of symbols to some degree. So individuals who perhaps have a significant visual impairment might need larger symbols. They also might need smaller symbols. Depends on what their vision skills are like. So you need to talk to a vision specialist. If you're working with a student who has some fine motor skill deficits, you then might need to be thinking about the size and the placement of symbols. Are they going to be able to readily access those symbols? If they need to point to them, are they going to be able to point and not make accidental hits by touching nearby symbols? Do they need more space in between symbols? If they're needing to lift symbols off of their visual schedule so that they can indicate something is finished, do they need to have symbols be a bit larger so that they can actually grab onto them because their motor skills aren't very good? So those are things to think about. And then other things in relation to visual impairments that you might need to consider has to do with stuff like background and foreground. So you see the picture on your slide right now has a black background with white lines. That's sometimes easier for students with visual impairment to see, or black background with yellow line. Or they might need some tactile input. So you need to think about those kinds of things too. And it's really important for us to consult with appropriate professionals that might have information that we don't have, right? So I'm often consulting with vision specialists and OTs and PTs because they have information about motor skills and about vision that I don't know about. And so they can help inform me in terms of the decisions that I'm making clinically, okay? So like I said, if you want more information on symbol assessment, this is the most recent version of the Augmentative and Alternative Communication textbook by David Buchelman and Pat Miranda, and it was published in 2013, and it has a section on symbol assessment. It also has all kinds of other great things in it. I have also heard that the next edition, the 4th edition, is being worked on as we speak. So probably in the next few years, it usually takes them a couple of years anyway, to get a new version finalized and out and published, but the 5th edition should be coming before too long. All right, so before we go on and talk about anything else, do we have any questions?
We do have one question.
Perfect.
How do you have the time to do this for each child who needs it when you don't even have a prep time during the day? Classroom observation for a student referral for special education services has to be squeezed in while my aide takes all our students.
Sure. So time is always an issue, and it depends on what your role is and what kind of time you have. So a lot of my work is as a private consultant, so that does afford me a bit of time. But I have taught classroom aides how to do symbol assessments. And I've had classroom aides do the symbol assessment. And sometimes what I'll do is have them videotape the symbol assessment so that I can look at it just to make sure that everything is kind of as it should be. But that's one way. I've taught parents to do symbol assessments. So sometimes it's about getting creative about how we use the people that we have available to us. Sometimes you can get students who, either SLP students or special ed students who are on practicum, who could help with some of these things. The symbol assessment itself often, itself doesn't take too long, 20 to 30 minutes in a session, and I would often spread those out with a couple of days in between anyway. But like I say, I would certainly look at training some other people, and they could be classroom aides and assistants. They could be SLP aides. They could be other kinds of aides. So depending on what's available to you in your setting, I know that time is always difficult, and sometimes it's about getting creative and seeing if we can get someone else to help us with that work. Did that answer your question? I hope. I don't see another question coming up, so I'm going to assume that it is. Are there any other questions? You're very welcome. Okay. I wish I had better answers on the time thing. There's never enough time, and I feel your pain because I'm in the same predicament sometimes that you guys are all in, and it is a difficult thing to do. But many of these tasks are sufficiently straightforward enough too that we can teach other people that we are supervising to do some of this work and then help us with it. Okay, so I also promised you before the end of today that I would spend some time talking to you about materials, and frankly, I would just help you spend some of your money because pretty much I've spent all of mine now, so I can help you spend yours. There are all kinds of things that you can purchase to help you get your visual supports put together. And Some of the things you're probably familiar with, and hopefully I'm going to be able to give you a few hints of things as well, and ideally to save you a bit of money too, because I know that people end up spending an awful lot of money trying to create visual supports, and over the years I've figured out a few shortcuts for getting things cheaper. Certainly not cheap necessarily, the cheaper comes later, but getting symbols usually costs a bit more money. I'm suspecting that most of you are familiar with Boardmaker. Could I maybe get you guys to raise your hand if you have experience with Boardmaker, just so I can get a read? Okay, so several of you, thank you. You can put your hands back down. Several of you have some experience with Boardmaker. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, it is software. It's authoring software. It includes a library of several thousand symbols, and you can then create all kinds of things with those symbols. Now, I kind of come from the old school Boardmaker where it's on my computer. I have a disk. I run it off my disk. More recently, the Mayor Johnson Company, makers of Boardmaker, they introduced an online version where you pay a $99 per year subscription. I don't yet recommend that for lots of people. If you're already using it and it's working for you, great, carry on. But as someone who's used the desktop version for quite some time, I've seen some differences between the desktop version and the online version. One of the things about the online version is that you can only save to the Boardmaker cloud. So you can't save to your actual computer. If you work in a situation where for privacy issues and data safety issues, you can't store student information in the cloud, that might be problematic because you might have some visual supports that are unique to given students and might contain some private information. So sometimes that's an issue. The other thing that I just don't like is that if I'm trying to share something that I make in the online version with someone who is a desktop user, I can't share that because they're different file types. So I find that a bit problematic. I also find that with the online version, they haven't embedded all of the same authoring tools that the desktop versions have. So I get a bit frustrated when I'm trying to do things with the online version that I know I can do on my desktop version that apparently cannot be done in the online version. And I'm not the only one who's kind of complained about this. I go onto the Boardmaker user boards and I see other people who are longtime users complaining of similar things. So I'm kind of hoping that in the next few years they iron some of that out. But right now, I recommend that people use the desktop versions. The most recent change with desktop versions and Boardmaker is that they have discontinued the Mac version. So if you're using a Mac disk, as you update your operating system, you'll find that it doesn't work quite so well as it used to because they're no longer updating that software. They are at this time still keeping the PC software. So if you're not a Mac user, you're still kind of in luck because they're keeping that going. So you can kind of make your choices. I like Boardmaker because I can do more with it than just simply make a page of symbols. When we get to the third session and talk about academic supports, you'll see the variety of things that we could make with Boardmaker. And Boardmaker is really the easiest software platform to do much of that authoring. So all of the prices up here are in US dollars. I converted all my Canadian dollars to US for you all. So these are the US prices. And if you're planning on purchasing the desktop version, I recommend buying the addendum libraries. So it says 2000 to 2012 addendum libraries. Those are sets of extra symbols. So back in the old days, every 2 years, they would put out a disc with additional symbols that people had suggested. And so all of those symbols are available there now. And then more recently, you can get more symbols just by downloading off of their website. Okay, so that's Boardmaker. And the Mayor Johnson Company, they're the people who produce and sell Boardmaker. So that's the website that you would go to get more information about that software if you're not already using it. The other thing that I use quite regularly is Symbol Sticks Prime. And Symbol Sticks Prime is an annual subscription, so it's $82.95 for you south of the border. And it's a web-based symbol search engine. And you can create materials on here, but the authoring is not as nice as Boardmaker. It's not as flexible. So I still like to author in Boardmaker, but Symbol Sticks has over 30,000 symbols, and they add new symbols every month. They've got way more symbols than Boardmaker has. And they've got things like Justin Bieber and like all kinds of sort of pop culture-y type things, although I don't think Justin Bieber is really pop culture anymore. But they have all kinds of sort of current event type symbols because they are updating every month. So what I will do if I need a symbol that's not in Boardmaker is I will go to Symbol Sticks, I will get that symbol and import it into Boardmaker, and then I can add it to my Boardmaker library. But I like Symbol Sticks because sometimes I can't get everything that I want in Boardmaker, and Symbol Sticks usually has it. So this is the link for Symbol Sticks Prime, and they also have a bunch of other products. News to You is kind of the company, and the News to You, they also have a newspaper that's often used in special ed settings that you might be aware of, that's sort of a symbol-based newspaper for literacy and language kind of work. So they have a whole bunch of products there as well. If you're looking at photographs, certainly you can take your own pictures, but you do need to make sure that you're taking really high quality pictures. There are collections of photos that you can purchase. So Picture This and Picture This Photos in Boardmaker Libraries are two discs that you can purchase. If you use Boardmaker and you want to add the photos to your Boardmaker, you would buy the Picture This Photos in Boardmaker Libraries Deluxe, and it adds 5,000 photos to your Boardmaker software library. So then when you search in Boardmaker, it would pull up photos and picture communication symbols. If you just want the 5,000 pictures, you just get Picture This Pro Edition and you've got 5,000 photos, okay? So you can use that software for sure. You can also take your own digital pictures with a nice solid background, only the target item in the photo. People will use Google Images, and I use Google Images sometimes as well, but you kind of have to be careful because sometimes the quality is not very good. So if I'm trying to find images for, here in Vancouver, BC, where I am, we've got a place called Science World. If you've been here, it's this great big silver domey thing. And I'll go online to get an image of that because there is no symbol that looks anything like Science World. I will not take just any random photo though. I will go to the Science World website where they have a high quality image of the big silver dome, and I'll use that for my symbols. So you just want to be careful that anything you're using for photos are maximally clear, that they're really good, sharp, crisp photos, because often we're using photos with people who are already having some difficulty understanding two-dimensional representations. So we want to make sure that it's really clear. If you do want to buy Picture This or Picture This Pro, the Mayor Johnson Company, makers of Boardmaker, they sell that as well. So that's where you could go to get those. They're also often available in teacher stores, and you can probably get them on Amazon as well. Laminators and laminate. If you're working in a school with a laminator, yay, because then you can get your laminating done there. I'm no longer in a K-12 school system. I'm faculty at a university, and we don't have a laminator for such things. So when I'm doing my clinical work, I use my laminator at home. And I've bought an awful lot of laminators over the years. And what I have found is that most of the laminators that you would buy in like an office store, they're not sufficiently high quality. They don't heat up enough to really stick the laminate down onto the paper, and they tend to break pretty quickly. The brand of laminators I found that work the best are the Royal Sovereign laminators. They're very high quality. I have one now on my desk that I've had for close to 20 years, and it's still going strong, and I've laminated thousands and thousands of pages with it. So they're very good quality, and they're not super expensive. They're usually in the range of $200 to $300, depending on how fancy you get. And they're sometimes available on Costco online, and if you get them from Costco, they're a little bit cheaper. So those are really good laminators. If you're going to put the money out for a laminator, I've found that that's a really good brand, and it doesn't break down. when you're using laminating pouches, get the thicker laminate, so thicker plastic. You want to look for 5 to 7 millimeter thick laminate because they'll be sturdier. When you're thinking about symbols that are cut out and have Velcro on them and kids are taking them on and off of displays, if it's thin laminate, they break down much more quickly. 5 to 7 millimeter thick lasts longer, and it also lasts longer if you print your symbols on cardstock paper rather than regular paper. Okay, and laminate at a really high heat setting. So I always laminate basically as high as I can have my machine go. And sometimes I'll even put my pages in through twice to really make sure I heat them good, because that reduces the likelihood of the laminate peeling off. There's nothing more frustrating than having Velcroed a whole bunch of symbols and then all the laminate peels. So high heat. The other thing that you need to think about is Velcro. And I always say to people, don't go buy it at your neighborhood stores because it's really expensive. You get tiny packages with a foot of Velcro for a lot of money. Instead, purchase big rolls and hook and loop. And that's the US. I buy from a Canadian hook and loop company. This is the US hook and loop company. And you can get a 25-yard roll of loop or hook Velcro. So loop is the soft and hook is the rough. 25-yard roll for $44 a roll, and it lasts a long time. You can also get the little coins, which are the little round Velcro pieces, and a 1/2 inch of hook coins, so 1,400 and some coins, is $60 a roll. And I will often buy the coins, and I will get hook coins, the rough kind, to put on the back of symbols that I'm cutting apart for a visual schedule. Just because the coins, although it costs me a little bit more money, it saves me a lot of time in cutting pieces of Velcro. So it's worth it to me, the extra, almost $20 to buy the coins and not have to spend my time cutting. The Velcro rule is to always put the hook Velcro, the rough Velcro, on the back of symbols and photos. And you use the loop, the soft stuff, for your display pages, for where you're going to store your symbols. And there are a bunch of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that sometimes you might want to use display loop fabric to stick your symbols on for a large wall display. And so you have to have hook so that the symbols will attach to the fabric. Next week, when we talk about visual scheduling, I'm going to show you a portable schedule system that also uses this fabric. So you don't want to have soft Velcro on your symbols. You want to make sure the rough Velcro is on your symbols, and then just make that the general rule so that your symbols will stick to anything, okay? If you're interested in display loop fabric, here's the link, industrialwebbing.com, where you can purchase that, and that's a US company as well. And the brand of fabric is called Veltex. It's $13.50 a yard, but it's 60 inches wide, so you get quite a lot of cloth for it. And there are 19 color options, so it's really useful for wall displays. I support an adult woman in her home right now, and she's got a large wall of symbols that she uses for visual scheduling, and they selected the sort of rose-colored cloth because it matched the decor in her home, so it can also look nice. This is an example of display loop fabric in another home for another child. They chose gray, but you can see this is a dining room wall. It's probably about 3 inches high, or 3 feet high by about 5 feet wide. It's a really large section of symbols, and this was for a young kid with autism. These were all of the symbols for his daily scheduling, and they're all sort of categorized because then it helps people find things easier. They're also alphabetized. And then in the bottom left corner, right down here, you see that things are all kind of mixed up. This would be after he had them in his schedule and they needed to be refiled. This was the refiling place. And, every evening after the kids went to bed, mom or dad would refile the symbols and put them away where they belonged. So that way everything was easy to find. And here's just a close-up so you can kind of see what a section of that looked like. You also see that I've got 3 symbols for each, in this case, place. That's just because sometimes you lose things. And that way, if you lose things, you've got extra symbols until you have time to make more, right? So it just gives you a little bit of buffer. and it tends not to leave you in the situation of having no symbol to represent what's going on. Okay. A few other miscellaneous materials that I'll often use, non-stick scissors if you are cutting Velcro. So if you go to a craft store, ask them to show you where the non-stick scissors are, and it's kind of like a Teflon coating on the scissors. It's often in the scrapbooking area, but that way when you're cutting your Velcro, it doesn't completely stick your scissors up. I used to, before I had non-stick scissors, I had sort of rubbing alcohol that I would have to clean my scissors off with to get all the gunk off. So non-stick scissors are nice. It makes it faster. 35 millimeter slide pages for organizing and storing 2-inch graphic symbols. So this thing that you see down here on the bottom right-hand corner, it's for storing photographic slides back in the day when we used to have slide carousels. But these perfectly fit 2-inch by 2-inch graphic symbols from Boardmaker, for example. And so it's a great way to store things. And I'll show you some different ways that I use this kind of a sheet for visual scheduling next week when we look at visual schedules. It's a bit more difficult to find these things now because most people are not using photographic slides anymore, but I did find them on Amazon this summer, so you can get them on Amazon and get a whole stack of them. Photo album pages are also useful for organizing and storing photographs, so just your 4x6 photo type books. And then finally, this small drawer thing that's on the bottom of your slide, it's an organizer that usually is sold in hardware stores. And I'll use that also for storing small graphic symbols. Sometimes when I'm doing a monthly calendar type display for a kid and we're using paper symbols, I'll have a whole page of school symbols, for example, all cut up and in one drawer. And another page of symbols for swimming, all cut up and put in another drawer, so on and so forth. And then at home, the parent has a monthly calendar and they glue the symbols onto different days that reflect what the student's going to do that day. And we'll look at some examples of that when we look at visual scheduling next week as well. Okay, so those are just some additional materials that you might find useful as you start to go forth and make things. Okay. Any other questions about that before I go on? Let me just take a quick peek. I don't see any open questions. Anybody want to throw a question out there? No, we look okay. All right. So basically, let me kind of summarize what we've gone over today and then get you set up for what's going to be coming in the next couple of weeks. So in general, when we're talking about visual support strategies, we're really talking about strategies designed to take advantage of the strengths that many individuals with autism or other developmental or intellectual disabilities have. So there's strengths in terms of concrete thinking and rote memory and processing that visual spatial information, the stuff that remains in time and space. We're taking advantage of those things to really address some of the other deficits or challenges that they experience, okay? For individuals with autism, developmental disabilities, other kinds of complex communication needs, they do tend to understand information when we present it to them in a form that's static and non-transient. So it remains. They can look at it for as long as they need. They can refer back to it as often as they need, right? And it really takes away a lot of that unpredictability or the disappearing nature of through the air communication. These are individuals who tend to have lots of difficulty with temporal information. So things delivered by speech or gestures or sign language where it's kind of in the air and then it disappears. So we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of those kinds of strengths. Okay. Oh, I see I've got a question for online or app programs for pictures and communication. We're not going to talk about apps so much, but there are some online pictures that are available. I can take a look and maybe pull a few links. I tend to find, though, that using a standardized program where you're getting a consistent type of symbol that you're using, I find that to be better. If I'm using an online source for pictures, the one that I'm typically using is Symbol Sticks because they have the most available. Okay, does that answer your question? Good, I wanted to hit that before I moved on too much further. Okay, some other things to remember. When we think about visual support strategies, we've had many research groups looking at the research and overall have determined that visual supports are an evidence-based practice. And increasingly, that's something that we're paying attention to, certainly in school settings, but also in other clinical settings. We're really focusing on implementing and using practices that have evidence to support them. And at this point, we can all feel fairly safe and secure in our use of visual support strategies as an evidence-based practice. Much of the research has been conducted with people who have autism, but certainly there has been research to support the use of visuals with other kinds of individuals who have other needs besides autism. So this, although often is sort of pumped as an autism thing, it's really appropriate for many individuals who have many different kinds of challenges. So other developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, complex communication needs, multisensory impairments, those kinds of things. We've talked about the variety of representations that we can use. So you're now familiar with the idea that we might use objects or photographs or graphic symbols in the form of line drawings or even text. That not all representations are appropriate for all individuals. Some people will require objects, others will do just fine with graphic symbols. Some people might use more than one kind of representation. So again, you might have a person who uses both objects and photographs, right? And they're sort of transitioning. In terms of determining your representation or representations for a given individual, a symbol assessment can really help guide you in that process. Certainly, if you're watching an individual and you've got kind of a sense based on perhaps interview information, a bit of classroom observation, and you kind of have a sense that a person understands something, you might make a trial set of symbols and try to use those for a few activities and see how it manages, right? How does the person manage with that? And if all is good, then carry on with that kind of representation. If it's still unclear, then you might need to take the time to do a more formal symbol assessment, okay? When you're doing that symbol assessment, you can structure it in a variety of ways to meet the needs of the person you're focused on. So if they have an understanding of instructions, point to or look at or give me, you could use a receptive language format. If they have a clear yes/no response, you could hold up items and ask them, is this and get a yes/no answer. But most often, if your students, if your learners are similar to the learners that I work with, individuals with autism, individuals with intellectual disabilities, or pretty complex communication needs, most often we're going to be using a visual matching format. It gives us a more accurate picture of what they really understand, and it typically is taking advantage of a skill that they already know how to do, or a skill that's pretty easy to teach them, and to teach them fairly quickly. At the end of the day, you want to make sure that you've got a pretty solid sense of what representation is going to be most appropriate for any given learner, because you don't want to spend a whole bunch of time making visual supports and spending money laminating and Velcroing and all that kind of stuff just to discover that everything that you spent a whole bunch of time making isn't useful for the individual you designed it for, right? So the symbol assessment, although it does take some time, can save you time in the long run. All right? Okay, so before I tell you about what's coming up, are there any other questions that I can answer for you? Or are there any other things that you kind of want me to keep in mind for the upcoming presentations? Because certainly if I haven't addressed something, or if you're afraid I might not address something, I'm happy to kind of take a few notes and make sure that I try and meet all of your needs. Will I be covering higher level methods of tuning into students who have a visual learning style? Well, I'll be talking about the different kinds of visual supports for students who do access information better visually. So we'll be talking about things like visual schedules and behavior kinds of supports next week. And then 2 weeks from now, I'll be giving examples of ways that you can use visual materials to make academic content more accessible. And much of that will be focused on learners who might be more challenged, but certainly I'll be giving some ideas as well of how might this translate, for example, to a kid who's in high school biology and they're working on labeling the parts of the cell or something. Does that kind of answer your question? I hope. Great. Any other questions? Needs, wants, desires, wishes? No? All right. Well, certainly if anything else comes up, I'm sure that you could either contact Tessa. I'm also easy to find via Google. So if you have questions, I'm usually open to answering emails. So that's never a problem either. Let me tell you a bit more about what's coming up so you know what to expect over the next couple weeks. So next week, we're going to be talking about visual scheduling. And again, because I kind of work in the research world as well as the clinical world, I feel the need to kind of talk about the rationale. So I'll talk a little bit about what it is we know about visual scheduling and why this is an effective approach for lots of the individuals that we support. I'll be talking about and showing you a variety of ways that you can structure your visual schedules to set up your visual schedules for different kinds of learners. And then I'll be talking about using visual schedules to kind of go beyond just telling people what's going to happen in their day, but really working to teach skills, to increase independence, to support transitions, to teach individuals to make and indicate their choices, to work on things like vocabulary development and concepts around time, and also to share information across people, right? And this is something that often the parents that we're working with would really love, is if their kids could come home and share some information about what happened during the school day at the dinner table when everybody else is sharing information. So we'll talk a little bit about how that can work. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to talk about visual support strategies for academic participation and literacy development. So I'm going to be focusing a lot on how we can take things that are happening in the classroom and adjust them or add visual support strategies to them so that they're more accessible for students who have either complex communication needs or developmental or intellectual disabilities, so that not only can they be participating in what's happening in the classroom, but they're also meeting their individualized instructional goals, because sometimes people think that it's got to be one or the other, but in fact, we can make sure that people are included and participating, but still meeting their instructional goals, which may be quite different from the goals for the rest of the students in the classroom. So we'll be looking at some ways to do that, and I've got loads and loads of examples for you. We'll also be looking at some visual support strategies for early literacy development, so how we can support people that are really just at the beginning stages of developing emerging literacy skills, and we'll look at that. And then we'll also talk about ways to adapt and modify literacy and academic activities, not only to increase participation, but also to improve learning. And I've got quite a few examples from a variety of sort of classroom situations to give you hopefully some ideas of things that you could do in your own settings. So all of that said, is there anything else that people can think of that I could help you with? I see no open questions. Tessa, would you like to close us out for the afternoon?
All right, great. Yes, hi. Thank you. So I sent out the survey link, everyone, so you'll find that in your chat window. So again, if you could take just a couple minutes to complete that survey, we'd really appreciate it. I also sent out a link to download the handout, and that same link will be where you'll find the recording to this webinar, and that will be posted tomorrow morning. So just a couple of reminders there. Okay, well, have a great evening, everyone. Thank you again, Brenda, and we'll see everyone next week.
Thank you very much. Have a good week.
Bye.